So if you've ever walked up to a classic courthouse, one of those massive older buildings, there is a very specific feeling you get, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's designed to make you feel a certain way.
Right. I mean, you look at the architecture, you've got these massive stone columns, the heavy oak doors, the perfect geometric symmetry everywhere. It's not just an aesthetic choice. It's a very deliberate psychology at play.
Yeah, the building itself is essentially trying to project this illusion of absolute mathematical certainty.
Yes, exactly. Mathematical certainty. You walk into that space, and you're basically supposed to feel like the justice system is this flawless, objective machine.
Like calculator.
Right, like you input the facts of a crime, the gears of the machine turn, and it outputs this perfectly calibrated, morally unassailable consequence.
And we crave that structure. The physical space really insists on its own infallibility because the alternative is actually terrifying to think about.
It really is. I mean, we desperately want to believe that when society extracts a penalty, especially a super severe one, it is doing so with the precision of a physicist.
Right, rather than the messy, emotional, somewhat chaotic guesswork of actual human beings.
But the reality for you and for anyone who actually observes the system is that the second you step past those marble columns and watch the system in motion, that whole mathematical illusion just completely shatters.
It falls apart really fast.
Yeah, you are suddenly just neck deep in human fallibility, in competing moral philosophies, and just the immense crushing weight of state power.
Because the landscape of justice isn't a pristine laboratory. It's not a sterile environment.
No, not at all. It is a profoundly complicated, inherently murky ecosystem.
And, that murkiness reaches its absolute critical limit when the state decides to permanently extinguish a human life.
Which brings us perfectly to our mission for this deep dive today. We are going to unpack one of the most intense and honestly enduring moral dilemmas of modern civilization.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It is, and we are pulling all of our insights today from a really comprehensive, incredibly dense analytical text. It's titled, Question 83, Is the Death Penalty Ever Morally Acceptable?
And we should probably establish our boundaries for you, the listener, right out of the gate here.
Yes, absolutely. Important disclaimer.
Right. So our objective today is not to litigate a specific political stance. We are not here to tell you which side of this divide you belong on or which side is unequivocally right.
No, not at all. The source text we are analyzing, it doesn't operate like a partisan manifesto. It's not shouting at you.
No, it's much more like an architectural blueprint of the debate itself.
I love that description, an architectural blueprint.
Yeah.
So we are going to map out the philosophical load-bearing walls of both sides of this argument.
Because the tension here is, it's the ultimate tension, right?
Right. The question of whether a justice system can ever legitimately authorize the deliberate killing of a citizen.
Right. And supporters build their whole case on the premise that certain acts of violence are just so catastrophic that anything less than death essentially fractures the moral order of society.
While the critics on the other side counter that, well, the state simply lacks the moral authority to take a life, period.
And that human institutions are just way too structurally flawed to wield that kind of irreversible power.
Exactly. So by the time we reach the end of this deep dive, you are going to walk away with a much sharper, a much more rigorous framework for evaluating how society actually defines punishment.
And how we conceptualize human worth, and ultimately how we justify the immense power we just hand over to our institutions.
So let's jump right in. Let's begin with the oldest, probably the most deeply rooted justification for capital punishment out there.
The intuition of desert.
Yes, the intuition of desert. The text refers to it as the bedrock of retributive justice.
The foundational idea here is proportionality, right? The belief that the severity of a punishment has to correspond directly to the gravity of the offense.
Right. Proportionality. And it's a really fascinating concept because, historically speaking, it was actually introduced as a limiting principle.
Yeah, this blows a lot of people's mind.
It totally does, because you hear an eye for an eye, and you think, oh, that's just a mandate for medieval brutality.
Right, you assume it's just endorsing violence.
But originally, it was a civilizing constraint. It meant only one eye for one eye.
Exactly. It was put in place to prevent these massive, escalating blood feuds. A situation where someone steals your sheep and in response, you go slaughter their entire family.
Right, which was happening. So this rule demanded that the punishment remain strictly anchored to the specific weight of the crime.
So, under this retributive framework, the justice system basically operates like a thermodynamic equation.
I love that analogy from the text, a thermodynamic equation. Break that down a little bit.
Sure. So, imagine a crime introduces a specific quantum of suffering or disorder into the world.
Okay.
Justice then requires the state to apply an equal and opposite force to balance the equation.
Right, to restore the equilibrium.
Exactly. So, if someone commits a minor infraction, let's say they're shoplifting, the disorder introduced is pretty minimal.
So the state applies a mild counterforce, like a fine or maybe some brief probation.
Right. The punishment simply absorbs the impact of the crime.
But then when we escalate to the absolute extremes of human behavior, we're talking premeditated mass murder, systematic torture, acts of profound cruelty, the text points out that this thermodynamic equation faces a massive crisis.
Because the offender has introduced this catastrophic, virtually infinite level of suffering into the world.
Right. So the logic of desert suggests that the state must now apply an ultimate counterforce.
And the source material articulates the core of this retributive position with a very stark, very uncomfortable question.
Yeah, it really doesn't hold back.
No. It asks, why should a person continue to enjoy the basic good of life after deliberately and maliciously taking that exact good from others?
And that phrasing, it completely strips away the emotional layer of revenge, doesn't it?
It does. It frames it as a pure philosophical deficit.
Right. The pure retributivist is arguing that allowing a murderer to keep their life like, to just continue breathing, experiencing consciousness, maybe reading books or forming friendships in a prison cell, it violates the moral equilibrium.
Right, because the offender has stolen something completely irreplaceable.
So allowing them to retain their own existence is framed as this fundamental injustice to the victims and to the moral fabric of society itself.
Death, in this view, is literally the only currency large enough to settle the debt.
Now, I understand the internal logic there. I really do. But I feel like we have to rigorously test that assumption.
Oh, absolutely. And the text demands that we do.
Because the leap from, this horrible crime requires the ultimate punishment to death is the only valid ultimate punishment, that feels like a really significant philosophical jump.
It's a massive jump.
If the goal is just to apply a counterweight that matches the severity of a murder, why does the state have to literally mirror the physical act of killing?
Right. Why biological equivalence?
Exactly. Let's look at the mechanics of life in prison without the possibility of parole. You are taking away a human being's entire future.
You're permanently stripping them of autonomy.
Privacy, freedom of movement, the ability to meaningfully participate in human society.
Yeah.
I mean, you are functionally erasing them from the world of the living.
Relegating them to a cage for decades until they naturally die.
Right. So why doesn't that immense, crushing deprivation of liberty satisfy the thermodynamic equation we just talked about?
Well, that right there is the pivotal counterargument in the source text.
Right.
If proportionality simply requires a penalty of devastating severity, rather than, a literal biological equivalence, then lifelong isolation and total loss of liberty could easily fulfill the requirement of desert.
It really seems like demanding a literal life for a life relies on this overly literal interpretation of what a gallant scale looks like.
Right. It's almost too neat.
Yeah, like if a criminal burns down a building, we don't sentence the state to go burn down the criminal's house.
Right. We extract the equivalent value through other means. Fines, asset seizure, imprisonment.
Exactly. The abolitionist argument builds precisely on that distinction. They argue that a civilized justice system does not perfectly mimic the crimes it punishes.
Right. We don't rape rapists. We don't torture torturers.
Right. Therefore, the demand for proportional severity does not inevitably, logically dictate a demand for execution.
So if life imprisonment can theoretically satisfy the requirement for an ultimate devastating consequence, it really forces us to look much closer at the underlying motivation of the death penalty.
Right. If society already possesses a tool that permanently incapacitates and severely punishes the offender without requiring the state to kill,
And society still chooses to kill anyway.
then what is actually driving that choice?
Well, the source text suggests this is exactly where we transition from discussing principled retribution into much darker territory.
The volatile territory of revenge.
Ex-
So let's pull those two concepts apart for a second. Retribution versus revenge. Because I feel like the public discourse almost always conflates them.
Oh, constantly.
We tend to assume that because the legal system uses clinical language and takes place in this formal courtroom setting, that everything it does is calculated retribution.
Right. We trust the aesthetic of the courtroom.
Exactly. But the text argues that revenge often masquerades as retribution.
Yeah, and we can differentiate them by looking at their actual operating mechanisms.
Break that down for us.
So retribution is fundamentally backward-looking and objective. It looks at the rule that was broken, it assesses the objective severity of the violation, and it applies a standardized penalty.
It is impersonal by design. It's the math equation.
Right. Revenge, on the other hand, is completely subjective and highly emotional.
It doesn't care about universal rules at all.
Not even a little bit. It cares about the specific psychological pain that was inflicted. Revenge seeks to inflict suffering, not to balance an abstract ledger, but to achieve an emotional catharsis for the wronged party.
To make them feel better. And the real friction here is that a horrific murder, naturally and understandably, honestly, generates an overwhelming desire for revenge.
Oh, of course it does.
When a community or a family suffers an unimaginable loss, that anger is visceral. It's real.
And the legal system, which is supposed to be this detached, marble-columned institution,
Right.
is suddenly subjected to this massive, heated public pressure to deliver emotional satisfaction.
The text actually highlights how the state often ends up acting as a sort of laundering mechanism for that public vengeance.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
You have the prosecutor standing up in court, wearing a sharp suit, citing statutes, speaking the language of retributive justice.
But the underlying energy driving the demand for the death penalty, the public outrage, the media frenzy, the political pressure, it is often pure, unadulterated revenge.
We see this so clearly when we examine the role of the victim's family in the sentencing phase.
Right, victim impact statements.
Exactly. Now, the source material insists that the trauma of the victims must be treated with profound respect. We can't have a theoretical conversation about the offender and just ignore the shattered lives left behind.
Absolutely.
And many grieving families passionately advocate for the execution of the murderer. They articulate that seeing the offender put to death provides a necessary closure.
A societal validation of their anger.
Right. And a final acknowledgement that their loved one's life had supreme value.
And the text acknowledges the deep psychological validity of that desire.
Right.
But it also points out the fatal flaw in building a justice system around it.
Because victims are not a monolith.
Exactly the problem.
Yeah.
For every family that demands an execution, there's another family that violently opposes it.
Right. Some families of murder victims feel that a state-sanctioned execution merely compounds the trauma.
It's just adding another corpse to an already devastating situation.
Exactly. Or they simply hold personal or religious convictions that prohibit them from supporting the taking of a life, no matter how justified it might seem in the moment.
And this creates a massive structural paradox for the legal system.
Okay, let's walk through a scenario to illustrate this, because I think it's crucial.
Let's do it.
Imagine a scenario where two separate, completely identical crimes occur. Let's say two convenience store clerks are murdered in cold blood during robberies by two different offenders in different parts of the state.
Okay.
The crimes are factually indistinguishable. The math is the same.
Mm-hmm.
But in case A, the victim's family is fiercely retributive. They use the media. They demand the death penalty.
Right.
In case B, the victim's family is philosophically opposed to capital punishment and actively begs the prosecutor to seek life without parole instead.
Right. So if the justice system bends to accommodate the emotional desires of those two different families?
It ceases to be a system of justice entirely.
Right. It just becomes a therapeutic service for the survivors.
It essentially becomes a lottery based on the psychological disposition of the surviving relatives.
Offender A gets a lethal injection, and offender B gets life in a cell.
Not because their crimes were different, but solely because of the varying emotional needs of the people they harmed.
And a legitimate legal system just cannot operate that way.
No.
The source material emphasizes that while justice obviously must be deeply compassionate toward victims, it cannot be held hostage by their grief.
Right, because if the state's justification for taking a life shifts based on whether the victim's family happens to be forgiving or vengeful, then the state has completely abandoned the principle of objective proportionality.
It is simply executing people to make other people feel better.
Which completely undermines the entire moral foundation of the law in the first place.
Exactly.
If the state is just acting as a hitman for grieving families, it loses any claim to the higher moral ground. It is imitating the impulsive emotional violence that it is literally supposed to be policing.
And this naturally forces our analysis toward a much broader philosophical concept, which the text spends a lot of time on.
The intrinsic moral status of the human being, regardless of their actions.
Right. The text frames this as the human dignity argument.
This is often presented as the most fundamental objection to the death penalty, right?
Yes. The premise is that humanity possesses an inherent, unalienable dignity.
And unalienable is really the operative word there. It means it cannot be separated from the person.
Right. It cannot be forfeited. It can't be signed away.
Or even destroyed by the person's own horrific choices.
Which is, a highly controversial premise, especially when you apply it to individuals who have committed absolute atrocities.
Totally. But the dignity argument suggests that while the state has the authority to restrict a person's rights, like their freedom of movement, their right to associate, their privacy, it does not possess the authority to declare that a human being no longer has the right to exist.
Right. The distinction being drawn here is between limiting a person's agency and nullifying their ontology.
Their very existence.
Exactly. Locking someone in a maximum security cell says your actions are so dangerous and abhorrent that you can no longer participate in society.
But executing them says you are no longer human. Your moral worth is absolute zero.
And critics of this view, they immediately raise the obvious objection.
Right, they say. Did the murderer respect the ontological status of their victim?
That is the ultimate counter-argument.
It really is. If a person commits a calculated, sadistic murder or, a mass casualty event, they have demonstrated absolute contempt for human dignity.
Right.
So if we look at the mechanics of a biological organism, think about it like this. When a pathogen enters the body and begins destroying cells, the immune system doesn't sit there and respect the pathogen's dignity.
No, it eradicates the pathogen to save the host.
Right. So why shouldn't a society act exactly like an immune system when it's faced with an individual who acts like a pathogen?
It's a compelling analogy. But the abolitionist response to that biological analogy is that a justice system is not an unthinking immune response. It is a conscious moral agent. And the text uses a very specific phrasing here. A just society should not imitate the moral logic of the offender.
Oh, that's powerful. The pathogen doesn't have a moral code, but the immune system doesn't either. But the state must have one.
Precisely. The murderer operated under the logic that they had the right to decide who lives and who dies based on their own criteria of value or anger or whatever.
Right.
If the state responds by saying, we also have the right to decide who lives and who dies based on our criteria of value, then the state is adopting the exact same moral framework as the killer.
It is just applying it with better paperwork.
Exactly. Better paperwork and better lighting.
That is a profound indictment of the practice. It really suggests that a civilization's moral superiority is defined entirely by its restraint.
We prove our commitment to human dignity not just by how we treat the innocent, but by how we flat out refuse to treat the guilty.
We refuse to let the murderer drag the state down into the mud with them.
And this commitment to fundamental dignity also ties directly into another big concept in the text, the concept of rehabilitation and the capacity for moral change.
Right, the idea that human beings are not static entities.
We are temporally bound, constantly evolving creatures.
Although I think we need to be very precise here about what rehabilitation actually means in this specific context.
Yeah, that's important.
Because we aren't talking about a Hollywood redemption arc where the murderer learns to paint, feels really bad, and gets released back into society to start a new life.
No, for a heinous crime, the person is never leaving the prison walls. The source is very clear that the physical accountability remains absolute.
Right, a sincere apology does not resurrect the dead.
Exactly.
The rehabilitation we're talking about here is entirely internal. It is the ontological possibility of a human being realizing the true horror of what they have done.
Experiencing genuine remorse.
Yes. Developing a moral conscience that they previously lacked. It's about the soul, or, the psychological equivalent of it, undergoing a fundamental shift over decades of deep reflection.
And execution permanently forecloses on that possibility.
Just cuts it off.
It freezes the individual in time, it forever defines them entirely by the worst hour of their life, and then just annihilates them before any internal evolution can occur.
Whereas life imprisonment holds the person completely physically accountable while still preserving the biological and psychological space for that internal evolution.
But, the text doesn't shy away from the extremes here. It explicitly brings up what it calls the hardest cases.
The hardest cases. Right, because we have to confront reality.
We do. We have to confront the unrepentant serial killer, the terrorist who is actively proud of their mass casualty attack,
The individual who displays absolute zero empathy and will clearly, demonstrably, never experience a moment of remorse in their life.
Right. So if the dignity argument relies on the potential for moral growth, what happens when that potential is demonstrably zero? It's a tough question.
It is. But the text argues that a moral principle is entirely useless if it only applies when it's easy.
Oh, that's a great point. The hardest cases are the stress test of the society's foundational ethics.
Exactly. If you claim that the state lacks the authority to intentionally kill a captive human being, that rule has to hold even when the human being in question is utterly repulsive.
Because the moment you create an exception for the worst of the worst, you have completely conceded the core principle.
You've given the gain away.
You have admitted that the state does have the authority to decide whose existence has value and whose doesn't.
And once that door is open, the only debate left is where to draw the line.
Which is terrifying.
Right. So the abolitionist stance is that the door must remain permanently welded shut, regardless of the offender's lack of remorse.
Okay, so this philosophical debate about intrinsic worth and state morality is fascinating, but I feel like a significant portion of the public discourse ignores it entirely.
Oh, yeah, completely ignores it. A lot of people approach the justice system purely as a pragmatic tool for social engineering.
They don't care about Kantian ethics or the ontological status of a murderer.
Not at all. They just want to know one thing. Does the death penalty make the rest of us safer?
Right. The utilitarian defenses of capital punishment. This moves us right into the arguments of deterrence and incapacitation.
Okay, let's dismantle deterrence first. Because the logic seems super intuitively sound to a layman, right?
Sure, people are afraid of dying. Therefore, if you threaten them with death, they will not commit the crime.
It is a basic behavioral incentive structure.
And the text acknowledges that if this premise were empirically true-like, if executing one murderer quantifiably prevented 10 future murders, the moral calculus would shift dramatically.
Because preventing the slaughter of innocent people is a supreme moral good.
Exactly.
But the behavioral psychology underlying the deterrence theory is just. It's fundamentally flawed, isn't it?
It is deeply flawed. It completely relies on the assumption of the rational actor.
Explain that for the listener.
Well, the rational actor theory is the idea that a person contemplating a murder sits down, engages their prefrontal cortex, runs a calm cost-benefit analysis.
Right. Weighs the probability of apprehension, calculates the length of the appeals process.
And then rationally decides whether the ultimate penalty outweighs the immediate benefit of committing the crime.
Which contradicts almost literally everything we know about the pathology of violent crime.
Everything.
Yeah.
The source points out the realities of how these acts actually occur. They happen in the grip of blinding rage.
Or during intense domestic disputes.
Under the severe influence of narcotics. Or in states of profound mental psychosis.
The limbic system just completely overrides the prefrontal cortex in those moments.
Entirely. The part of the brain that would process a long-term consequence, like an execution 10 or 20 years in the future, is functionally offline during a crime of passion or panic.
It's just not computing. But what about premeditated murder?
Right, where the limbic system isn't hijacking the brain. Even there, the deterrence model still fails because of a different psychological blind spot. The illusion of invulnerability.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the premeditated killer isn't deterred by the death penalty because they are absolutely convinced they will never be caught.
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
A penalty, no matter how insanely severe it is, has zero deterrent value if the subject believes the probability of it being applied to them is zero.
Exactly. The psychological mechanisms just don't support the theory.
But, let's play devil's advocate for a second. Let's follow the utilitarian logic to its terrifying endpoint.
Let's do it. The text poses a hypothetical here.
Right. Imagine if we could prove that deterrence worked. Let's just say that for every execution we perform, the murder rate demonstrably drops by 5%.
If pure deterrence is your only justification, you run into a grotesque philosophical wall really quickly.
Because if the only goal is to maximize fear to prevent crime, why stop at a sterile lethal injection behind closed doors at 2 a.m.?
Right. Why not broadcast the execution on live television?
Exactly. Why not bring back medieval torture? I mean, if fear is the primary mechanism of safety, then the state actually has a utilitarian duty to make the punishment as horrific and public as humanly possible.
And furthermore, you could justify torturing shoplifters because achieving a 0% shoplifting rate would technically be a societal good.
Right. The absolute absurdity of that hypothetical really proves the point. We universally reject public torture, not because it wouldn't deter crime,
but because it violates a higher moral principle regarding cruel and unusual punishment.
Exactly. The text uses this to demonstrate that deterrence can never be the sole overriding justification for a justice system. It always has to be subordinate to human rights and proportionality.
So if deterrence is essentially a psychological myth, we are left with the final pragmatic defense: incapacitation.
The protection argument.
Right, the idea that some individuals are simply too dangerous to ever breathe free air again.
And the need to protect society from violence is undisputed in the text, right? Everyone agrees on that.
Absolutely undisputed.
But the method is what gets heavily scrutinized.
Right.
If the goal is strictly to prevent an individual from walking into a grocery store and harming a civilian, well, a maximum security prison cell made of reinforced concrete and steel accomplishes that goal with literally 100% effectiveness.
You do not need to chemically stop someone's heart to keep them out of a grocery store.
No, you just need a strong lock.
But supporters of the death penalty push back on this, and they point to the realities of the prison environment itself.
Which is a fair point. They argue that a murderer serving life can still murder a prison guard.
Or they can murder another inmate.
Or they could potentially coordinate with criminal syndicates on the outside to order hits, or run drug rings from a contraband cell phone.
All right. We have all seen the headlines about cartel bosses who just continue to operate their empires from inside a penitentiary.
So how does the source material address that? Because that seems like a very real concern.
It addresses it beautifully, actually, by exposing it as a category error.
Okay, walk me through that. A category error.
Yeah, so think about it like this. If an inmate is able to smuggle in a cell phone to order a hit, or if they are able to access a weapon to stab a guard, that is not a failure of the concept of life imprisonment.
Oh, I see.
That is a failure of prison administration.
Oh. Yeah.
It is a breakdown in institutional security, staffing, funding, and basic protocol.
That is a devastatingly sharp distinction.
Isn't it?
The argument for executing a prisoner to protect the guards is essentially a confession that the state doesn't know how to run a secure prison.
Exactly. You are using the death penalty to compensate for administrative incompetence.
Right. If the walls are porous, the solution is to fix the walls, not to execute the people behind them.
Once you realize that the protection argument is actually just a debate about institutional capacity, all the pragmatic justifications for capital punishment really begin to collapse.
Because if deterrence doesn't actually work, and if a well-run supermax facility provides absolute incapacitation,
The death penalty is revealed to be practically unnecessary.
which means the entire weight of the practice rests on the assumption that the state is morally justified in performing an unnecessary killing.
Right.
And to justify that, you really have to possess absolute unflinching faith in the flawless accuracy of the judicial process.
You have to believe that the system never, ever makes a mistake.
Which brings us to the final and arguably most insurmountable obstacle in the text.
The reality of irreversible error and the actual mechanics of state power.
We started this whole analysis by talking about the illusion of the courthouse, right? As this perfect, objective machine.
Right, the marble columns.
This is where we have to look at the actual human beings pulling the levers inside that building.
Because human epistemology, our ability to know things with absolute certainty, is just inherently limited.
We get things wrong.
Constantly. And the text really outlines the systemic flaws that plague the justice system.
Like eyewitness misidentification, which is, notorious in psychology.
Right. Forensic science that is later proven to be complete junk.
Coercive interrogations that actually produce false confessions.
Prosecutorial misconduct where evidence is intentionally withheld just to secure a win.
And of course, the structural, racial, or economic bias that infects quite literally every level of the process.
Well, the system is operated by tired, ambitious, biased, and sometimes corruptible human beings.
We see exonerations all the time, right? People walk off death row after 20 years because DNA technology finally catches up, or a key witness recants.
We know as an empirical, indisputable fact that the state convicts innocent people.
And when a person is wrongly convicted and sentenced to prison, it is a massive, tragic injustice. A huge portion of their life is stolen from them.
It is terrible. However, the state retains the ability to halt the ongoing injustice.
Right. They can release the prisoner. They can issue a pardon.
They can attempt to offer financial restitution. They cannot reverse time, obviously, but they can stop inflicting the harm.
Because imprisonment is a reversible state.
But execution is an absolute finality. Death represents a complete severing of all possibilities.
And this creates what the source material describes as a profound ethical asymmetry.
Let's really explore the mechanics of that asymmetry, because it's the crux of the whole issue.
Okay, so if a punishment is completely irreversible, the tolerance for error in applying that punishment must logically be zero.
Exactly. But because the system is operated by fallible humans, the error rate can never be zero.
Therefore, applying an irreversible punishment through a fallible system is inherently unethical,
It forces society into a terrifying calculation.
which is,
How many guilty people are you willing to execute if you know mathematically that you will inevitably execute one innocent person alongside them?
wow. Is the system's need to administer the ultimate penalty really worth the guaranteed sacrifice of an innocent citizen?
Let's use a procedural analogy to understand the gravity of this because I think it helps ground it.
Go for it.
Imagine a highly complex medical procedure. It is designed to cure a very specific, very aggressive disease. But this procedure has a known, unfixable margin of error. Say, 1 out of every 100 times, it kills a perfectly healthy patient due to just a systemic glitch.
Yikes. Okay.
Furthermore, this procedure is entirely elective. Because there is an alternative treatment, let's call it life imprisonment, that manages the disease perfectly well without any risk of killing the healthy patient.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right. If a hospital bureaucracy continued to mandate the lethal elective procedure despite knowing its fatal margin of error,
We would consider that hospital administration criminally negligent. Or, honestly, perhaps psychopathic.
the analogy holds perfectly. The state knows its margin of error, it knows the alternative exists, yet it continues to authorize the lethal procedure anyway.
And that leads us to the grand synthesis of the entire text, doesn't it?
It does. It requires us to make a fundamental distinction between the philosophy of the crime and the reality of the government.
The source material draws this brilliant, brilliant line between moral desert and public policy.
These two concepts are almost always treated as the exact same thing in public debate, but they are entirely distinct.
Right. Moral desert asks, based on the horrific nature of this crime, does this specific offender theoretically deserve to lose their life?
And public policy asks a completely different question. Do we trust this specific, historically flawed, politically motivated, bureaucratically messy human government with the uncheckable power to kill its own citizens?
The epiphany here is that you can answer those two questions differently.
That is the big takeaway.
You really can. A person can look at the actions of a serial killer, feel the full visceral weight of retributive logic, and conclude, yes, morally, that individual deserves to die.
But that same person can simultaneously look at the criminal justice system.
With its history of racial bias, its reliance on totally underfunded public defenders, its political pressures.
And conclude, however, I refuse to grant this government the authority to administer that death.
You can believe the death penalty is morally deserved in theory, while recognizing it is just practically impossible to administer justly in reality.
The state is simply not a clean enough instrument to wield a power that permanent.
It demands that we evaluate the justice system not on its idealized intentions, but on its actual observable behaviors.
And the text suggests that the danger of granting the state the power to kill far outweighs the theoretical satisfaction of achieving perfect retributive proportionality.
So as we pull all of these threads together, the architecture of the dilemma becomes incredibly clear, doesn't it?
It really does. The text forces us out of the theoretical vacuum.
Right. In a vacuum where guilt is mathematically certain, where deterrence operates perfectly, and where human dignity is somehow easily quantified, sure, perhaps you can build a flawless argument for execution.
But the justice system does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in the messy, complicated reality of human civilization.
When you introduce the reality of executing the innocent, the realities of institutional racism and poverty, the total failure of the deterrence model,
and the inherent dignity of human consciousness.
the foundation of capital punishment really begins to crack under the weight of its own contradictions.
The deepest question we are left with isn't really about the murderer at all.
No. The murderer's actions are known, and they are abhorrent.
The true question is about us. It's about the collective.
Should you and I, as members of the society, actively maintain an institution that demands irreversible violence to solve its problems?
The strength of a civilization might not be measured by its willingness to destroy its worst members, but by its capacity to securely contain them without abandoning its own foundational ethics.
Justice may reach its highest form when it completely neutralizes a threat imposes total accountability, and still refuses to mimic the violence that necessitated the punishment in the first place.
It's a profound shift in perspective.
It really is. We have dissected the mechanics of proportionality, revenge, human dignity, deterrence, and the incredibly perilous nature of state power.
We covered a lot of ground today.
We did. But before we finish, I want to pose a final scenario for you, the listener, to turn over in your mind. This directly challenges the distinction we just made between moral desert and public policy.
Oh, this is a good one.
Imagine we fast forward 50 years into the future. Technology has evolved to the point where the justice system is no longer reliant on human fallibility.
Okay, sci-fi scenario.
Right. We have developed an artificial intelligence network integrated with perfect, ubiquitous surveillance. Every crime is recorded with absolute clarity.
The AI analyzes the data with zero racial bias.
Zero political ambition.
And zero margin of error.
The problem of the wrongful conviction is entirely 100% eliminated. The system is mathematically certain.
So if we remove human error from the equation completely, does the moral argument against the death penalty collapse?
Or does the core principle of human dignity, the belief that the state should never intentionally extinguish a human consciousness, still demand that we refuse to take a life, even when we are perfectly certain of their guilt?
It really forces you to determine whether your objection to the death penalty is merely a practical complaint about bureaucracy or a profound, unshakable moral absolute.
Think about that the next time you see a news alert about a high-profile sentencing, or the next time you walk past a courthouse with those towering marble columns projecting flawless certainty.
Remember that the equations inside are never perfectly balanced.
And the power we grant to the state is the most dangerous variable of all. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.